Alright guys, so this week I want to talk about something that I have just been non-stop thinking about, and that is the Evangelical Egregore. By the way, if you want to see these videos 2 weeks earlier, consider subscribing to my Patreon, where you not only get all these videos, but also recipe cards, specific deity profiles, and lots of other interesting things to look at. Video tiers start at $10 a month, so definitely consider checking it out. So earlier in the week I made a video about the Evangelical Egregore, and a lot of people have been wondering, like, what even is an egregore, and how can we distinguish the difference between this evangelical mess and the actual God of Israel? And well, that's exactly what we're here to talk about, and it's a wild ride, so buckle up. So first things first, when we think about an egregore, the most important thing to know about it is that an egregore, especially in occult philosophy, is a thought form, right? A thought form is what happens when enough people pour their energy and their hopes and their belief into an idea that eventually takes form, right? And some examples of how this have kind of worked, especially with Jesus, is probably in Neil Gaiman's American Gods, right? Where there were multiple different Jesuses that all kind of were a little bit different depending on how people thought about him and how people, poured their conceptions of Jesus into one idea. It's also important to note that egregores are the reason that pop culture paganism is even viable, right? So egregores are definitely not necessarily a bad thing, and in fact can actually be kind of cool, right? So there are a lot of pop culture pagans who work with and worship the egregores of like popular movie, video game, book characters, because enough people have poured their energy, belief, and love into those characters to basically make an interactable, like, poltergeist almost. It's an egregore. It's not. There never was a Percy Jackson, spirit rolling around before its inception, but after enough people came to love that character, it became part of the zeitgeist. It became part of the spiritual ecosystem, which is really interesting to think about. And it's an example of how egregores can be really cool, but that doesn't mean that they're not dangerous. As you might imagine, there is a real Jesus, and then there is any of the 20 billion different iterations of Jesus that people have conceptualized over time. Each one of these is kind of its own thought form at this point, and each one of these is something you can encounter at any given point. Luckily, the thing about egregores is that they are not generally mean-spirited or aggressive. They're not trickster spirits, right? A lot of times egregores don't even know that they're egregores. They just know whatever they have been told by the beliefs that have fed it. So, for instance, another really great example of a common egregore that's been around recently, especially on Witch Talk, are egregores of Hades and Persephone. There is an alternate Hades and Persephone egregore, most likely, that is exactly the lore Olympus kinda relationship that people really want them to have, but isn't actually accurate. And so with Hades and Persephone, we can kind of see the same thing as that's happening now, but just on a slightly less destructive scale. But still, the end result is that the actual gods are left to stare in bafflement at these people who are worshiping more of a really strong hope that the story of these gods are not real than the actual gods themselves. It's not cute, it's not good, no one likes it, right? No one likes it except the people who desperately don't want the actual stories of the gods to be what they are. And the way that you can catch these egregores is by asking them questions that they wouldn't know, right? So the real God or the real Hades, they will know the answers to the questions that you are asking them, no matter what they are. The egregores are not going to know those answers. If you try to ask them through tarot or other means, it's not going to make any sense, and you're not going to know what to do after that because they're just speaking gibberish because they don't have any of these answers. They might not realize that they don't have those answers because they're a fake god, basically. And then once you get to that point, it's easy to just say, oops, okay, bye. That's an egregore, moving on. But now that brings us back to the core of this conversation, which is the Evangelical Egregore. I feel like a lot of us have asked the question of where did this idea of God come from? Are Evangelical Christians even following God at this point? Do they even know who Jesus actually was? right? I feel like a lot of times we have asked ourselves those kinds of questions, and from what I understand of an egregore, and from what I understand of evangelical Christianity and its inception and its history, no. They do not realize that they are probably dealing with an egregore, nor do they know what an egregore is, or that they have made this monster, basically. So let's back it up where I actually finally managed to put two and two together and understand this. I had been really hesitant, right, to say that this was an egregore and this wasn't actually God, because I didn't want to be a proponent of no true Scotsman fallacy. I didn't want to sit there and say, oh, they're not real Christians, they're not, but they're not really following God. But the unfortunate reality is, while they may be Christian because they believe in God, they don't understand that the God that they are putting all their attention to is one that they created. And this came up most notably when I read Kristen Corbus Dumes's Jesus and John Wayne. Yeah, the title of this book is really rough. Like, it's really a crack in the head right away, but it's a good title. It's a relevant title. It's a necessary title. And what this book does is essentially go through the last century, so the 20th century up into modern day, and really tell us, like, how evangelical Christianity became what it is today. And a lot of that starts with, you guessed it, war. So it turns out that at one point, which largely is because of Victorian classism, there became a moment where it was more honorable to be able to fight with words than to be able to fight with fists, right? It wasn't very cultured or classy or whatever to be out there just duking and brawling. Unless it was an official duel, you just didn't do that. It was more about, like, you know, the Romantic era, all these nice written philosophies and all these other things. It was about intellect. It was about education. It was about highfalutin status. And a lot of those Victorian ideals of gentility and all these other things, they were kind of the standard for the higher class. So likewise, you know, this type of Christianity that followed was very much focused on being gentle, being kind, being courteous, soft-spoken, and, you know, things that generally we would probably still associate with Christianity, knowing Jesus, right? Well, that was also a time period where it was a lot easier to get an outlet and an expression of masculinity through your labor. For the average laborer, they could feel masculine, like the men out there working, because they were working with their hands, right? They were building things, they were working in mines and in factories, they were doing a lot of heavy, big stuff that only men could really do, right? And so a lot of their understanding of masculinity came from these farming jobs, mining jobs, construction jobs, so on and so forth. They were not really looking for an outlet for masculinity by anything else at the time. They also had World War I, which for a lot of people actually turned them off, right? A lot of people thought that, you know, it's a duty to fight for the goodness of the world, but after seeing the horrors of war, they got very distant from the idea of war, obviously, naturally, and they kind of lost a lot of that fire that had been kind of being puffed into Christianity with the onset of World War I. And that's where we see two camps split off. We have people who said, war is not the way, and as Christians we shouldn't be about war. And you had people saying, whoa, you just have no faith, because actually we have to, you know, be more militant than ever. We have to be strong in order to keep the world safe, basically. World War II kind of saw more of the same, where now, I mean, it really was a battle for, like, people, right? We had to save people, help people, but still, you know, war has a lot of tragedy, and so that was really the last war where people could at least hold on to the idea that they were fighting for a good cause, especially, you know, with America and the Allies. But with World War II also saw the advent of women in the workforce, and women doing all these jobs that were traditionally only for men, because all the men were gone, and so women had to pick up all that slack. And they did, and they liked it, and they didn't really see why they had to go right back home doing what they always did, when they just proved totally capable of doing all of these other things, right? So now, as we have a bunch of men who believed that their place as men was to work these jobs and go to these wars and all these other kinds of things. We have a very big cultural problem just in that sense alone, but then also as the industries continue to develop and people start working more in offices rather than, you know, out in these very much, you know, manual labor jobs, now also the idea of masculinity is becoming more abstract and remote because these men aren't working with their hands anymore. They're stuck in a cubicle, wearing a suit and tie, being all kinds of stuck and stuffy and sitting around at a typewriter for however many hours a day. That doesn't feel as manly. At least it didn't for them. And so as the title of the book would imply, it was around these times that we had figures, right, like John Wayne, stepping up and becoming a face for Christianity. How? I don't know, because John Wayne was actually not that great of a guy. He was divorced a bunch of times because he would, like, just be mean and rough and a womanizer and all these other kinds of bad things that obviously would cause people to divorce you. But yet still, he became the face of Christianity because Christianity was turning away from those Victorian ideals and more towards this kind of projected masculinity that kept men's egos safe. It was actually thought that Christianity was for women and old people because it was all about turning the other cheek and being gentle. All of a sudden, here come all these men like John Wayne and Billy Graham and everybody else to say, no, Jesus was actually really masculine, manly, and tough. And then especially around this time, World War II and just after, the wheels start falling off. We start getting a lot of gender complementarianism, which is the idea that men and women are very like direct opposites and that they exist to complement each other, and therefore everything men can do, women cannot, and everything women can do, men cannot, right? So we get a lot of these harsh ideals. We get a lot of interpreting scripture to say that men here, women here. We get a lot of other problematic things going on, especially as things progress and the civil rights movement now is picking up, and also people don't want to go to war for Vietnam because Vietnam's a sticky, bad situation, and no one really won in that mess. As these things continued on and, you know, people started making books like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, the most conservative of Baptists and Methodists started coagulating into this evangelism. And in this evangelism, it very much became the case where men here, women here, but specifically white men here, white women here, everybody else. The civil rights movement was not popular with evangelicals. They had started using phrases like law and order, you know, obey law and order, as code words against communities of color, and then they were very much trying to enforce on their congregations the idea of obeying authority, including the government, which was God ordained, until the point that that same authority started telling them to desegregate schools. Then all of a sudden you saw a lot of evangelical leaders actually pairing up with the KKK and doing a lot of other interesting things like promoting private Christian schools to continue and protect some idea of a segregated society. Very messed up, but you'll see a lot of big names like Phyllis Schlafly, who despite running for House of Representatives ran on the slogan that women belonged in the home. And also like James Dobson, whose organization Focus on the Family was entirely built on the idea of the, you know, nuclear family model. Husband, wife, kids, right? And I mean, I'm telling you guys, if you can stomach it, you can read this book for yourselves, but none of it is pretty. None of it is pretty. None of it at all. And like, we got people teaming up with the KKK. We've got a lot of talk about religious freedom, and I don't want the government telling me how to raise my kids. And by that, they mean, like, don't let the government, like, you know, design school programs. Basically, don't let the government actually introduce sex education. Don't let the government pass laws against domestic violence because corporal punishment is good. Like, when I say every other sentence of that book felt like a hate crime, I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding at all. And even in the summary I gave was just a brief overview. But again, this book goes all the way up right to modern day, like right up to like when Trump got elected, and the monster evangelicals have created by basically militarizing and weaponizing their congregations politically, and how it's come to stab them in the back, because it got to the point where congregations would fall apart if the priest or pastor didn't support Trump. So rather than the pastor being able to have all the influence to tell people without directly telling them who to vote for, now it's just the other way around. If they didn't support this one political candidate, people didn't want to support them as pastors. That's where we're kind of at this point even. It's why you're seeing so many people with insanely bad takes on Twitter now, who run in these evangelical circles with just like crazy dumb takes on Twitter, saying really dumb things about what women should and shouldn't wear, and you know, women should be subservient and should submit and blah blah, and all these other just insane, wild things that you're gonna see on Twitter. Granted, it's Twitter, and we all know that Twitter's a cesspool, but still. The long and short of it is that evangelism was kind of created with this idea of a white male hierarchy, right? With white men sitting at the top and everyone else beneath them doing whatever they want. And the militant masculine idea of Jesus was not based on the Bible, but based on figures that these white evangelical men wanted to see themselves as, like John Wayne and like Ronald Reagan and like all of these other kinds of strong, tough men. They didn't want to identify with a Jesus who turned the other cheek. They wanted to identify with the Jesus who, with sword in hand, was going to come screw up all of his enemies, which made a different Jesus. We all talk about the white Republican Jesus. That's what they made. And now, the issue with this is that it's become very apparent that this brand of Christianity will not stop until the entire country, by hook or by crook, is under its thumb. And this is where we get the idea of Christo-fascism, right? And fascism itself is basically very nationalist, militarist, and puts one guy in charge of pretty much everything. Christo-fascism is the same idea, but it's actually Urban Dictionary that has the best definition of it, at least from what I found. But, you know, according to one Urban Dictionary user's submission, Christo-fascism can be best summed up as an evangelical semi-theocratical movement or a temperament of Americans who stand against abortion, sexual education, homosexuality, science, anti-Zionism, and the separation of church and state. When you think about what fascism is and how it does a lot of these same things, right, where like women are subservient, there's no real choice, la la la. There's a lot of militarism, there's a lot of nationalism, there's a lot of just nasty, toxic stuff. I mean, my God, we've all studied this in World War II, you know, history, right? You could see how it's repeating here. And especially where a lot of these people, they scream religious freedom, but only for their religion. They don't want Muslim people in the government. They don't want anyone who isn't Christian in the government really at all. They don't want non-Christian religions represented in schools or out in public. Right? They insist that their religion somehow supersedes everyone else's right to exist. And this is where we get a lot of those arguments about, you know, can people deny gay people a wedding cake? Which then snowballs into, can someone deny gay people medical care if they disagree with their lifestyle? Can some people refuse to sell gay couples a home if they don't agree with their lifestyle, right? We find this very slippery slope of shit that could happen if we allow this kind of rhetoric to pass. And we're also continuing to see these kinds of issues spring up now in modern politics. We already had Roe v. Wade overturned, which is something that evangelicals have been pushing for a long time, but also we have new things popping up every day that just insist on getting worse, right? For instance, we have State Representative Matthew Krause of Texas, who just put forward a couple bills in the House of Representatives to try and limit or even get rid of no-fault divorce. No-fault divorce is basically just saying that you can get divorced for any reason at all. Before no-fault divorce, you had to prove that your spouse was either cheating or was abusive. And if you couldn't prove those things, you couldn't get divorced. But, you know, according to one of these articles, right, Representative Krause says he thinks it should be harder to get divorced and that spouses should have to take more time to try and work their differences out. He thinks the changes would strengthen the family, which is very much a callback to James Dobson and his focus on the family nonsense. He explained that he thinks no-fault divorce does not give a spouse who opposes a divorce any grounds to fight it. I'm just going to say this, why would you want to oppose a divorce? If someone doesn't want to be with you, they don't want to be with you. What kind of wacko tries to force someone to stay? But I digress. So by taking away women's right to choose, but also their right to get away from a partner they don't want to be with anymore, I mean, it's kind of obvious where this is starting to go, I feel like. And of course, we also just have more than that, right? We have Florida's with the Don't Say Gay bills. We have a lot of anti-trans legislation popping up. We have a lot of just nasty rhetoric across the board going on here in these really hardcore, radical right circles. Stuff that is really harmful to people. And it's all based off of this Evangelical Egregore, which is basically taking the name of God and the name of Jesus and taking it away from all of these things that reasonably made up the Bible, right? Ideas of love and caring for one another, love thy neighbor, healing the sick and feeding the poor and abolishing or, visiting prisoners, abolishing prisons, all these other kinds of things, these radical, loving things. Get rid of all of that and replace it with more of the same. How you can use the Gospels to support and defend capitalism is still a mystery to me, but they do it. And so that's where we're at now. We have mainstream and especially evangelical Christianity going ballistic, trying to enforce this idea of a Jesus that never existed, that white Republican AK-47 slinging Jesus, that militant nationalist, macho, hyper-masculine Jesus. A Jesus that never existed until evangelicals poured decades of energy and belief and thought into that Jesus. And so ironically, I never really agreed with Gnostic Christians, who were a very early group of Christians that were later deemed heretical. Gnostic Christians said that the Old Testament God was actually an evil demiurge pretending to be the real God, and that the real God was all loving and sweet and nice, like in the New Testament. I never subscribed to that because all that really tells me is that the Gnostics didn't know much about the Old Testament or Jewish religion in general, which is very much focused on loving one another and being like kind and charitable and supporting a community. But now, if the Gnostics were around today and they said, there's a demiurge here, I wouldn't disagree with them until they said it was the Old Testament God. But now there is very much a demiurge, right? There is that idea of this fake God pretending, this God that is evil and drags people away from the truth and is nasty and destructive. But that God's not the Jewish God, the Old Testament God. That God's the Evangelical Egregore. And that Evangelical Egregore lives in a high control, high demand religion, one that has a lot of rules, a lot of standards, and a lot of, exclusionary elements to it, right? Where these people are basically told that they have to be dressed exactly so, act exactly so, vote exactly so, every X, Y, and Z, or else that they are not true Christians, that they have to play by a very specific and toxic set of rules. And I live by a bunch of really gross ideals, like as we see with purity culture, or else they are not worthy of the title. That they have to basically do what their pastor says, or else risk being turned away from their community, right? So that's a very high demand, high control religion, and this egregore gets tons and tons of energy from these, desperate people who are trying to fit in, who are trying to do what they're told is the right thing, and who are trying to appease the authority of this religion, the gatekeepers of this religion, like these pastors and such. So even if the egregore doesn't know it's an egregore, it doesn't matter, because that doesn't stop it from hungrily eating up all of the energy that people are throwing its way. And one of the key characteristics of evangelism that makes it really hard to deal with is that they thrive on a sense of embattlement. So the reading Jesus and John Wayne, actually what stuck out to me is that one of the places where they started really going hard and being successful is in places and time periods where they thought they were losing. So when it came to people like Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton or Obama being elected, these are when they felt the most under attack and when they got the most, activism, activity, donations, grassroots movements against, liberal ideas. This is when they started going hardest, right? Meanwhile, in times like when Reagan was around, those were the times when donations dropped off, where they kind of got a little bit complacent, where they didn't really engage as much anymore, because they didn't feel like they were under attack. And I know, so you're probably thinking, okay, well, what do you do about that then? Like, how do you reasonably deal with people who, when you deny them what they want, which is for everyone to subscribe to their religion, when those people feel embattled because people don't want to subscribe to what they believe, how do you reasonably combat these ideas and these ideologies without feeding those flames more, right? And I think one of the biggest places we can look to, ironically, is actually the Bible. St. Paul had some great advice in Romans 12:20. Paul says, on the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. It's by being nasty and being mean that honestly a lot of these people they dig their heels in further. They get even more set in their ways. And I know it's so tempting. I know I've caught myself doing it tons of times myself, where you just see these people and you're like, oh my god, go away. Like, stop. You're right. But the more you do that, the more they burrow in, the deeper they dig. And so it's so cheesy, but it's true. Kindness. Kill with kindness. And another thing with this egregore is that really a way to defeat it is by actually knowing the Bible. So another thing in Jesus and John Wayne is that these people, they kind of outright admitted that they don't know the Bible that well, right? And in fact, especially around the 80s, 90s, it started to become almost like a Disneyland industry surrounding this religion. And so in the 80s and the 90s, when the hardest and most conservative evangelicals started to take control of the companies and the publishers that would actually publish materials for church, we started seeing, that's when we started seeing a really dramatic cultural shift, to the point that other like Southern Baptists and Methodists who weren't so conservative and who weren't so, far pushed like that, they actually started to say, hey, whoa, this isn't fair. You guys are just running right over us. The publishers didn't care, though. They went on to publish, stuff that had more to do with like the flames of hell, and you're going to hell if you don't do these 12 billion steps that no one actually said you had to do, right? Things like that. So that's when the faith kind of took a turn for the more strict and conservative, yet at the same time, it's also when the industry of Christianity started to really blow up. And I'm talking like Christian romances, shows like VeggieTales, Christian preachers who were more like celebrities than anything else, and all these other medias and music and other things to consume that had nothing to do with Christianity and nothing to do with the Bible, but still fostered a sense of Christian identity. That's what started coming up. And it turns out that a lot of these pastors admitted that their congregations and they themselves didn't really know the Bible that well. Theologically, they were not masterminds in any sense. But, as I said, when I talked about what ways we can identify egregores, that's one of the ways that you can identify what God someone is following, is their biblical literacy and their biblical understanding. A lot of people will tell you, read the Bible, and then in fact have absolutely no concept of the Bible themselves. Go figure. So yes, there are only two things that can get rid of a monster like this, and it is compassion and knowledge. These are the only things that can get rid of this kind of monster. But then another thing people ask is, okay, well, if I can identify the egregore, that's great, but how do I find the real God? It's a question worth asking, and I'm going to tell you the answer is not easy. Where you find this God, the God of Israel, the God of, Jesus, and so on and so forth, you find this God in the wilderness. There's a reason, that the Holy Spirit came up upon Jesus and drove him out into the wilderness, right? So out there, alone, where there's no one else to see you, hear you, where no one else can be there to validate your actions, and you just sit by yourself in private and just let it all out to God, that's where you find him. Between the Bible itself and Jesus' own experience and message, right, to go into your room, your closet, close the door and pray privately, as well as the experience of other people I've talked to, in which it's only when at the very small hours of the night when they just unload on God that he finally pops in and says something. You find God in private, away from, the ego, away from eyes that can serve to pluff you up for following God, so on and so forth. You find God where you least expect him. And you also find him when your heart is set on what God is about. And God is about two things most patently. He is about love and he is about justice. If you are trying to find God and you don't have a sense of love for your fellow man or a sense of justice to hold up the abused and the downtrodden, even if you go to the wilderness and even if you cry out, you will not find him, because God doesn't really care to deal with hypocrites or deal with people who call on him with no intention of actually displaying the things that he wants us to display. That doesn't mean that you're condemned to hell. That doesn't mean blah blah blah. It does mean, though, that God's gonna wait, right? He'll pull one of those, I'll wait. He will do that. He will absolutely wait until you get your shit together before he finally comes and says, oh, hi, right? God is much more likely to watch from afar until you figure these things out than he is to come to your door and try to force you to see them. God doesn't force anybody to see what they don't want to see. So if you don't want to see these things, and if you don't want to understand these things, you don't want to hear, you don't want to see, you don't want to perceive and understand, God's just going to sit there waiting until you do. He's not going to force you to do anything. And this also reminds me of another book I started reading, which is What Paul Really Said About Women by John T. Bristow, in which, he found out what Paul really was trying to say about women, which is none of the kind of stuff evangelical Christianity says it does. And as he started explaining these things to the church, he told a story about how one man stood up and said, well, I don't care what the Bible says, I still have my feelings. And he said that in a church. He said that in a church of God, which kind of tells you that there are people who follow Christianity or join Christianity or go to church not because they actually believe in the true God, but because they believe in their own prejudices and their own ego and their own hopes for a world that works for them and nobody else. And that's exactly what we see in evangelical Christianity, and that's why that Evangelical Egregore is so egregious. But okay, so if you are ready to go into those private spaces, I mean, like, you don't have to literally go out in the woods, but, if you're ready to go into that wilderness of the mind, right, and, like, be in those private spaces, and you are willing to open your heart to the concept of loving other people, loving your fellow man, and standing up for the people who have been systematically and institutionally abused, congratulations. That's the foundation. Next step to find God is to really just open your mouth and ask him to come to you, right? A lot of people actually don't realize that they are afraid to encounter God. They are very afraid to actually encounter that voice. They're afraid to hear the voice of God. They're afraid to actually let that spirit come down upon them, right? In which case, there are a lot of people I notice, whether on Witch Talk or just every day, who are uncomfortable with the idea of going to God directly. And there are avenues for that, of course. You can work with angels, you can work with saints, you can ask Jesus, you can ask Mary. There are a lot of people who work as waypoints, right, or wayfarers between you and God. And that's kind of why I believe Jesus also said, no one comes to the Father except through me, right? Jesus said that, and what I think he really means by that is that he is the ultimate mediator. If you are scared to approach the just straight, unfettered presence of God, as a lot of people tend to be, Jesus is there to help you get there. Jesus is there to mediate between pure divinity and pure humanity, right? Him being both. But above all, you have to be willing to try at all. You have to be willing to look God in the eye and say, hey, help me out. Help me do these things. Help me figure out who you are, because he will help you. If you are genuine and you come from the right place and the right intentions, oh yeah, he will come to you and he will dispel any such nonsense like this Evangelical Egregore. But there are so many people who, like that guy in that church, who didn't want to hear the truth about women. There are a lot of people who want to cling to the name of God, and by God, they actually mean the name of their own really toxic, harmful beliefs. So by getting rid of this Evangelical Egregore and fighting against this thing, we are reclaiming the name of God, right? Reclaiming the spirit of God, reclaiming the truth of who God is, and putting it back up where it needs to be, which is on display in front of everybody. By getting rid of the Evangelical Egregore, we can get rid of these toxic ideas about Christianity. And that's why you're seeing so many people across so many different mediums, whether Christian witch, whether just biblical scholar, speak up against these people, because these people are patently leading a lot of countries, actually, down a path to ruin, and causing a lot of damage to innocent people. And so it gets to the point where it's no longer about religion. It's no longer about how you personally identify or exercise your private spirituality. It becomes a moment where you decide what is actually important on earth, right? And of course, Christians are going to say, well, what's important is God. And yes, that's true, but if your definition of God is hierarchical, toxic power structures that hurt people, then first of all, that's not God to begin with, and second of all, that's the opposite of important. What it becomes about is about justice and love and mercy, which is exactly what Jesus wants us to do. Let's think about Matthew 23:23, where Jesus is accosting the Pharisees, as he tended to do a lot, and he's yelling at them, and he's saying, "You hypocrites, you gave all of your tithes of, mint and anise and cumin, right? Spices, right? Like material things or things that didn't matter, or like material things, things that were commanded by the law, but they forgot the offerings of justice and mercy and faith, which were just as important. Those are the things that we need now. And you don't have to be a Christian to value these things. You don't have to be any religion to value, sovereignty, justice, peace, mercy, love. These are universal values that unite all people across all faiths. So ironically, when you want to find God, it's not in the churches at this point. When you want to find God, it should be out there in the streets with the people who need the most help, marching alongside those who are the most abused. That is where you find God, and that is how you make change and do work that matters. As a Christian witch, I do have a lot of stock in just trying to get this nastiness off the name of my God. But I also understand that impulse is more of a selfish thing, right? Because God's big enough, he can handle himself in his own image. It's more important that we are, working to preserve our fellow man. God doesn't have an ego, and God doesn't need us to defend his name and his honor. God needs us to defend each other and help each other. And so far, a lot of people are doing exactly the opposite because they're pouring all of their energy and their hopes and their beliefs into this awful toxic egregore and not into the actual true God. So I'm finally bold enough to just say it, that nope, who these evangelicals are worshiping is not God, and they wouldn't care for Jesus at all if Jesus really stood in front of them. They would be the same kind of people that killed Jesus in the first place, ones who were obsessed with hierarchy and law, and not people who were actually bent on faith. So that was kind of a long topic with a lot of ups and downs and all arounds. So with that said, I hope this can help you kind of think about what things you can do to embolden other people and to support your communities through really difficult times with all of the crazy political nonsense going on these days. So with all that said, again, much love to you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. See ya.